Hi and welcome back to the History of Russia podcast. This is episode 4, Finno-Ugric and Steppe Nomads. Now before we get started on this episode, I just want to say thanks to 1D Larry Israel 124 and Petrushka for the reviews on iTunes. It really means a lot and thanks so much for the feedback. The feedback on the music is noted, however the long-term plan is for the music to evolve as the show progresses through the ages and through time. So for the moment you'll have to bear with the Slavic war drums. We'll reach Shostakovich and Stravinsky in good time. I'd also like to thank everyone else that's downloaded the episodes prior to this one. I'm so surprised, if not a little proud, that such a large following has formed so quickly. It has really surpassed my wildest expectations. Now prior to researching who the Finno-Ugrics were, I'll admit I knew nothing about these peoples that occupied and continue to occupy such a wide area of Europe. I'll throw my arms up and admit it was limited to knowing about Hungarians and Finns, but other than that, and perhaps that some tribes worshipped reindeers and elks in late antiquity, but prior to that I knew nothing else. The name, as you can probably surmise, comes from Finn and Urals, as in Finnic tribes from the Urals. Besides the aforementioned Huns and Finns, Estonians and the Sami people of the far north of Scandinavia are probably the two most well-known groups, outside of Russia at least. I was surprised to learn that there's no less than 5 autonomous republics in modern day Russia that are populated by this ethnic group, from the Karelian Republic on the border with Finland, the Komi Republic in the Arctic north of western Russia, the Udmurt Republic just to the east of the city of Kazan, the Mari Republic to the northwest of Kazan, and lastly the Moldovan Republic which lies south of Nizhny Novgorod. Now the language these peoples use is fascinating in the sense that it's completely unrelated from any other language in Europe. By that I mean it's not an Indo-European language, it's a completely different branch on the language tree and it's evolved completely in isolation. To put this into context, Latin and modern Russian have evolved from the same common language, however Hungarian and Finnish, they've also evolved from a common language, but it's completely unrelated to an Indo-European language. Therefore, there's no common ancestor between Finnish and, say, Russian. The religion of these peoples was varied. They were polyistic, that shares similarities with Old Norse, Germanic and Baltic religions. For instance, there's the god Ukko, who is the god of the sky and thunder. I'm guessing that sounds familiar, right? And as per other religions of the time, there was a number of different deities that revolved around worshipping key aspects of nature. Now these people believed in the existence of a soul, but unlike other religions, they believed it consisted of 3 parts, each being autonomous. The spirit of your life force, the spirit of your protector, and then the spirit of your personality. To me, and remember I'm no means an expert, only somebody that's read a couple of books and texts on the subject, this seems unique to world culture. In so much that the spirit of life force defined fate, but the spirit of the protector allowed you to escape or be protected from that fate. Now, Henki, translated as life, breath or spirit, sometimes referred to as loli, was a person's life force which presented itself as a breathing, the beating of one's heart or the warmth of their body. Henki was received prior to birth and it left you at the moment of death. The word hengeton, literally one without Henki, can be used as a synonym for dead in the Finnish language even now. Luonto, translated as nature, was a guardian spirit or protector. Luonto has also been referred to as the hejita of a person. A strong-willed, artistic or otherwise talented person was believed to have a strong hejita, who granted them good luck and skills to complete their tasks well. A weak Luonto could be strengthened by various spells and rituals. Luonto could leave a person's body without the person dying, but its lengthened absence would cause problems such as alcoholism and other addictions. Unlike Henki, Luonto would not receive prior to birth, but instead either at the time of getting the first teeth or by being given your birth name. A newborn child was thus considered to be particularly vulnerable. These concepts share basic similarities with the idea of Fliglia or follower and Amingia or luck in Norse belief. Itzy was a spirit received at the time of birth or a few days afterwards. It was believed to define one's personality, and receiving Itzy made one a person. In modern day Finnish, the word Itzy means self. Like Luonto, Itzy could leave one's body without the person dying, but long absence would cause illnesses and misery. Depression, for instance, was seen as the result of losing one's Itzy. If a person was diagnosed to be Itzian or Lunaton, i.e. without one's Itzi or without one's Lunton, a shaman or a sage could try locating the missing part of the soul to bring it back. Although Itzi and Lunto were usually lost after traumatising events, it was possible to purposefully separate one's Itzi from their body. This was required if a missing part of the soul needed to be found, for example. Itzi could also leave the body to appear as an apparition, i.e. as a ghost or in spirit form. At the time of one's death, their Itzi joined the other deceased of the family, or in some cases they stayed amongst the living as a ghost. In terms of the nomads that occupied Russia in the 8th century, there's just too many to name. To attempt to cover every group would be a podcast in its own right, so I think it's only prudent to only focus on those that would have a major impact on Russian and European history. To start off with, we have the Magyars, the Alans, the Bulgars, the Cumans, the Turks and the Khazars, who we'll cover in their own episode next time. The Scythians and Sarmatians will be overlooked for the sake of this podcast, if only because these peoples occupied the areas in a time too far in the past to be of enough significance to warrant inclusion at this point in the early Russian history. That's not to say they're not a fascinating culture in their own right, but as this is the History of Russia podcast, I think it would be doing a disservice to you, the listener, to cover people that didn't really have an impact on the formation of the early Russian states. All, except the Khazars, shared a common, if not the same, pagan religion that revolved around sky worship, that you may see in some sources named Tengri. This religion, reportedly adhered to by the Huns and Alans in the 3rd century, was almost identical to that some of the Mongols who would arrive on the scene a millennium later adhered to. It revolved around a chief deity, usually a white bird, which I've seen referred to as either being a swan or a goose, and it also involved some form of ancestor worship. The Magyars, as you're already probably aware, are the tribes that would eventually migrate from the steppe, terrorise Western Europe before settling on the Pannonian steppe, the very edge of the steppe grasslands that stretch across Eurasia in modern-day Hungary, eventually taking the name Hungarians and forming that nation-state in the 9th century, ironically displacing another steppe peoples that had done exactly the same many years before. The Alans, a name you might be familiar with, were a huge tribe that migrated from the Urals and possibly even further to the east in the 1st century. Some settled in an area that would later become known as Alania to the north of the Caucasus, while others would raid as far west as the Roman provinces in Gaul, eventually being settled there as federati, i.e. warriors that would serve in the Western legions in exchange for farmland within the Roman provinces. We'll be coming back to these people again next week. The Bulgars were a huge confederation of steppe peoples of Turkic origin. They formed a powerful state in the 7th century on the steppes, holding sway over many other nomadic peoples before eventually being defeated in a two-front war against the subjects, the Avars in the west and the Khazars in the east. This prompted a huge migration, with some going into the Balkans to eventually found the First Bulgarian Empire, whilst others sought refuge in the Lombardian state in modern-day Italy before being assimilated into that culture. Now the Cumans, or as they're often referred to as the Kipchaks, were a Turkic peoples, and they would have had a massive influence on our later history, particularly in the 9th and then again in the 13th centuries. And as a result, they're going to be a group that we're going to cover in their own episode at a later date, if only because we'll need to refresh our memories on who they were when we get to that time. In conclusion, thanks again for joining us. If you enjoyed this episode, and even if you didn't, I would love to read your feedback. If you can spare the time, I would greatly appreciate it if you could leave me a review on iTunes. Not only will this help the podcast grow, but it will also be invaluable in terms of feedback for myself. It helps me refine my presenting style and make changes that might be of benefit to the podcast as a whole. We're also on Facebook and Twitter now, so hop over to the Russian History Podcast on either platform to find us. Also keep an eye out on Instagram, where an account will soon be in place that will be sharing historical on this date in Russian history images. Next week we'll be rolling the clock back and looking at the Greeks and Romans. Now if you're puzzled as to why we'll be covering these, I think you'll love that episode. After that, without a break, you'll be pleased to hear, I'll be kicking off season 2 of this podcast, where we'll begin to really get into the history and look at the Rus, the Varangians, the Vikings. I hope you'll join me. Lastly, feel free to email any feedback directly to me at the russianhistorypodcast@gmail.com. And again, if you can spare the time, I would love it if you could leave us a review on iTunes. Thanks again. Ta-ra for now.